Thank you very much. Welcome everyone to the afternoon, the last day. I'm Debbie Miller from Marsh Healthcare Practice in the Baltimore office. And we're going to run through Employees Gone Wild. It's a pretty titillating, I guess, topic. And we have an esteemed panel. We have Steve Chang, who's with Beasley. He's the claims team leader out of the New York office, and he's responsible for working with the hospital clients, healthcare clients, ranging from healthcare hospital systems through miscellaneous medical, regulatory, international. Before that, his background is as a defense medical malpractice attorney in New York, as well as an assistant DA in New York City. Sue Kinter is next to Steve, and her background is as a nurse attorney. She's been with the University of Maryland Medical System risk management for 20 years now. You would never know. And her background also is as a medical malpractice attorney in the Baltimore area. Pete Clancy is from Clark Hill in Chicago, and he concentrates in helping healthcare clients from a reinsurance and insurance perspective. And he has also wide experience in medical malpractice and other commercial lines of coverage. So we're going to run through pretty much what we're seeing as current trends and some diving into some detail. To give a disclaimer, we will use some examples from press you've seen over the last 6-9 months. And again, it's just what's been in the press. And one of the messages you'll hear over and over again, as Larry said, is that it could be anybody. So they're just examples. I'm going to walk through what some of those consequences are, and then how do you manage against that piece, as well as what we're looking to see for trends going into the future.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming to the 2:55 session. The timing of this topic seems to be appropriate as we're at the annual holiday office party season, so it's the season of poor judgment and bad decisions, so the timing could not be better. So, employee-related crimes are nothing new. For as long as there's been a history of employment and a history of employees, there's been bad employees and really bad things that they've done. So employee theft, employee assaults, nothing new. But what's new, what we've been talking about over the past couple of days, what we're seeing is the extent of the employee misconduct and the sheer dumbness of sometimes what happens has increased in magnitude. And what we think is driving it is really whatever we see, whatever societal ills are out there are going to find themselves inside a hospital. And the reason why is there is no magic barrier that protects what happens on the outside from what happens on the inside. And so when we look at the categories of employee-related claims, the main buckets we're seeing are social media, violent crimes, and because it's the modern era, it's not just a single patient or single person, the crimes are larger by magnitude in terms of the number of people impacted. And then a more recent phenomenon that we're seeing quite often is drug diversions. And the issue what we're seeing is because these things are often on social media and the insatiable appetite for news on a 24-hour cycle is getting out to the public so quickly. And so much more people are finding out about it. They're a lot harder to hide. And the consequence of that is that we're seeing very large claims that are magnitudes and multiples of what we've seen, what saw 10 years ago. There is significant reputational harm. So when these articles get out into the news or end up on Facebook, people are forwarding them on. Within overnight, the institution's reputation can be significantly damaged. And really the big lawsuits, and that's what we're talking about a lot today. In the news, so I apologize for the micro font, but it really does kind of span the gamut of what we're seeing out there. And so I would suspect everyone in this room has had a moment over the past 12 months where you've seen something, read something, and said to yourself, holy cow, that person is such an idiot. And then, holy cow, thank God, that could have happened to my institution. Because what we're going to see is these are not bad facilities or bad providers. It is just simply bad luck that their particular employee committed the particular offense. So it also kind of demonstrates the breadth of what we're seeing on employee-related incidents. Some of them are fairly innocently intended, from a selfie that was inappropriate in the office, in the hospital setting, to things that are very much criminal, and we're pretty confident that that individual is going to spend a long time in jail. So the recent one is the Navy nurses who were taking selfies with the devil babies and giving the finger. That got a ton of publicity overnight, appalling, to things that involved actual patient harms and child pornography, rogue physicians, and rogue surgeons. And we're going to talk about that today. One of the common things that we're seeing are rogue docs performing procedures, not so much because of the medical necessity, but for billing purposes. And that has resulted in very, very large claims. So the first bucket of employee-related claims we'll talk about is social media. And we kind of see it in really 2 to 3 kind of types. The first one is the use of social media in the actual commission of misconduct. And that kind of, again, has a full spectrum there, right? So Sue had a great example the other day. I think it was National Nurses Day. That's great. And some of the floor nurses wanted to get together, take a picture of themselves together, put it on Facebook to celebrate National Nurses Day. Innocent and actually quite nice. Unbeknownst to them, the big patient whiteboard was behind them, listing all the patients' names, diagnosis, and codes. Problem, because now you have PHI floating out on the interwebs. On the other end of the spectrum, we'll get to an example after this, where the use of social media was much more sinister. So the use of social media can be innocent and innocuous to very much borderline criminal. The next use of social media we see quite a bit, and this is where Pete and I probably have always seen it, is not the illegal or misuse of social media, but the fact that they're using it all while they're at work. So, oftentimes the example that we've seen it is with high acuity patients, usually vent dependent, when the trach becomes dislodged, a code is called and no one responds, we'll check the phone records and we'll check the usage log, and sure enough, they were posting on Facebook or Instagram at the time the code was called, causing the delay.
And just to pick up on that point, your plaintiff attorneys are keyed into this too, and they're requesting personal cell phone records for the nurses or the aides who are on staff at the time something happened. So similar to if there was an auto accident, every good plaintiff attorney is requesting cell phone records to see if the driver was texting at the time the accident occurred. The same thing's happening in med mal cases.
And so what we have next are the current, I guess, the most common forms of social media. I actually think it's largely irrelevant. The type of social media they're using at the moment is going to change next year, and it's going to be completely different in 5 years. Pete and I are going to talk about a lot of the bad things we're seeing. Unfortunately, Sue is here, who will talk about how to fix a lot of that. But I think one of the themes is staying in front of what the trends are, rather than waiting and reacting till after the event occurs. So our first example. So this was a claim in the press, long-term care facility in Texas, where the employed staff member was taking nude photographs of the Alzheimer patient and posting it on Snapchat. Stupid. Unfortunately, the photos were seen by family members and other people in the community. It garnered a significant amount of press. So it was an isolated event of employee misconduct, but the ripples quickly spread out very far. First, we had a criminal prosecution of that individual. Not surprisingly, right after that, the civil lawsuit gets filed. So now your star witness is going to come out in Prison Orange, which is probably not going to help your case. The lawsuit, once they start digging into it and the investigation really kind of went further, of course they realized there were prior convictions for this employee. So instead of now being a rogue employee issue, it's an institutional issue. Why did you hire this person? Why did you bring this person into an environment with vulnerable patients? And now you're the cause of the injury. And as if that wasn't bad enough, the attention that it generated then brought in state and federal regulators. So a single event of not thinking had criminal, civil, and regulatory implications. The other interesting theme when we start talking about examples over the past couple weeks, a lot of these cases don't really have a clearly articulable physical injury. right? So in this case, the argument could be made, what actually is the harm or damage that was caused to a severely demented patient? But the reality is the facts are so inflammatory, the value was there. And as we'll see in the other examples, it's almost the fear of or the humiliation that's driving the damages.
And many states have, elder abuse statutes or patient bill of rights statutes that apply in long-term care context in particular. And those are just statutory remedies, and it really does not need to be a harm if there's some disrespect that's been shown to the patient. We'll shift over to our next bucket of possible exposures, and that's based on criminal activity by your employees. And don't underestimate or think that this is a problem for lower tier employees. Nurses and physicians are often implicated. I can think of a couple of examples. We had a hospital in the southeastern United States in which a physician's wife had been admitted with and her husband insisted on taking care of her. And it was suspected throughout the course of the lawsuit that followed, is that he may have tried to kill his wife and did not succeed and was trying to make sure no one found out about it. At the end of the day, we weren't able to prove anything, but those sorts of scenarios occur. Also worked on a case a group of cases in Southern California involving a nursing home in which the director of nursing hired one of the patient care techs to murder her husband. And of course, the murder plot was foiled. And it didn't involve that specific set of acts, did not involve any patient harm. But what it did do was hit the press, and it hit it big time. And one of the more prominent national plaintiff firms that handles long-term care cases took an immediate interest to that particular small nursing home chain and filed just suit after suit and developed all sorts of very interesting testimony during depositions of the director of nursing, that tech, other administrators, all of whom had been terminated and were no longer friendly to the defense. And one of the ultimate repercussions of that is that the insurance carrier that was providing liability coverage for that nursing home chain actually went out of business. That was not the only problem that the company had, but it was one of the last straws that put them into receivership.
Pete, if I could just add to that real quickly. So, part of what we're seeing is just the size increase. So, employee-related crime is nothing new. So even Pete's murder for hire, shocking, but I think I've seen that a couple times before. But what's so interesting now is the size of sometimes how many patients are injured. So we had we had that German the nurse, Angel of Mercy. I think they're up to 100 patients that he killed. So the numbers are a lot larger than it seems to be than it was 10, 20 years ago.
Yeah. And then along that theme, the case, I think everybody probably knows about this by now, Dr. Levy, who was the obstetrician who was taking photographs of his patients without authorization. That resulted in a class action that ultimately settled for $190 million. What I find most interesting about this case is that there were no patient identifiers associated with any of the individual photographs. So there was no way to say that Mrs. Smith or Ms. Barnes had the right of privacy violated, but they had the fear that their privacy had been violated, which is a quirk of Maryland law, which recognizes that type of a cause of action. But it also enabled the plaintiff attorneys to argue that, well, the class of potential plaintiffs here is every single woman within a certain age range that Dr. Levy ever treated. And so the number was north of 8,000 patients. He had been an employee of the hospital for 15 or so years, and before that he had had privileges for, I think, 3 years. So it was a huge number of patients. The ultimate recovery that any individual patient received was relatively small, but multiply it all out, and it was in tens of millions of dollars, more than $100 million before the plaintiff attorney fees.
So now we're going to move on to drug diversions. We've provided the definition of what a drug diversion is. And this isn't just something that's happening with doctors and nurses. It happens to all different types of patient care providers. It's also not isolated to what you would think would be the most common areas of a hospital, such as pharmacy or the OR. It can happen anywhere, at any time, and really involve any type of employee. It's interesting, when we were preparing for this, I was doing a little bit of research, and the DEA states that this is actually an $85 billion industry, drug diversion, which was shocking to me. We really don't have a lot of data showing really how widespread the issue is. Part of that is because people who divert drugs are usually very good at what they do. There are some who are not so good, and they usually get caught. But many of them are people who are addicted, have addictions, so they're used to kind of hiding that addictive behavior or addictive symptomatology. And so it can be very difficult at times to detect. In addition, the whole medication administrative process has many portals of entry. So a medication going from even when it comes into the hospital, through the central supply chain, to the pharmacy, to the units. There are many, many, many stops in that process that could be vulnerable and open the hospital up to a drug diversion. Although opioids really are probably one of the most commonly diverted drugs, there are many other drugs that are also diverted, such as athletic performance enhancing drugs, non-opioid psychotropic drugs. Those are things like benzodiazepine and muscle relaxers. A lot of times when we were reading, addicts like to combine the opioid with the non-opioid psychotropic drugs, and I guess it enhances the effect. When we look at kind of what employees are at risk for diversion, obviously, it's just all across the spectrum. We've talked about employees who do have addiction issues. That's certainly a population that is at risk for diverting. But there are also employees who just are going through a stressful time, might not absolutely or actually be addicted, but need something for a little stress relief, and so they go to diversion. Money. There are employees who will divert drugs because it can be very profitable. And then there are employees who will divert drugs because they know someone who needs them. They have access to the medications, and therefore they get them and give them to their friend or family member. There are a lot of liability risks that go along with diversion. Probably the biggest is the disease, or the possibility of spread of disease from the diverter to different patients. And we're going to talk a little bit about that example later on. And even if a patient doesn't necessarily get a disease from that diversion, under Maryland law, as Pete said, they can sue because they're afraid they might get that disease. And there's a window of time in which they are permitted to sue for that cause of action. Other risks about diversion, you have an impaired employee caring for patients. That's also always can be a significant risk to the institution. And then from an employer-employee standpoint, loss of work days. So impaired employees sometimes don't have the best attendance.
So our case example is also something that's made the press. This probably goes back more than a year at this point. Involved a radiology technician who had been siphoning fentanyl from patients, typically using a syringe and the IV line. And Sue has a remedy, a risk management response to that type of event. This technician had worked at 19 hospitals, and based on his own admissions, had been involved in this drug diversion throughout the entire course of his career. And he had been terminated by a number of the hospitals based on suspicion that something was not right about his activity. And some of the terminations were based on evidence that might be considered by some to be quite conclusive, but he was never reported to the police. He was never reported to there's an association that represents radiology technicians. He was not reported to the association. There was no action taken with respect to his license. He ultimately was caught because he contracted hepatitis from, presumably from one of the patients from whom he had extracted the medicine. And there was a spike in hepatitis cases at the last hospital where he worked, and then the internal investigation, followed by a State Department of Health investigation, started narrowing the focus and the cause. And he ultimately was charged criminally, and he's now in jail. The repercussions to the hospitals, another part of the chain of events is that for a period of time he was also working for a series of temporary staffing agencies. And so he was able to go through his drug screening when he applied for work at the temporary staffing agency, and had the ability to time his drug screening tests so that they came back clear, and then would resume his drug use prior to taking an assignment at a hospital.
Pete, if I could just add one thing. Not with this drug diversion case. Unfortunately, as an excess carrier, we've seen quite a few of them. One of the things that really stands out is how there were red flags throughout that employee's employment where someone should have said, hey, that's not good. And some of them are extreme. I think one example that I could think of, they found the employee passed out on the bathroom floor with a syringe in that employee's arm. No action was taken. In another case that we have, only reason why they caught the employee and they uncovered the diversion. And the second they asked the employee, what are you doing? The employee was completely honest, high as a kite, but honest, by saying, I'm stealing the fentanyl. And the reason why they caught this patient was they always found him hanging around the pharmacy after his shift had ended. And so the theme you're going to hear from Sue on the risk management side is just telling your staff, if you see something, say something. Because so much of what we're seeing, whether it was the photographs of the resident that was taken, someone knew. Whether it's the drug diversions, someone knew. It's getting your staff, everyone, to recognize if you see flags to report it.
And it's so interesting how healthcare providers care for their patients very, very well, but sometimes they don't care so well for their coworkers. So we had an event at a hospital where a coworker found another coworker, much like Steve said, passed out on the bathroom floor with a syringe and paraphernalia nearby. The coworker, instead of caring for the employee by making sure that they got help for addiction and all of that, cleaned everything up, put it in the employee's purse, called the employee's husband, splashed some water on the employee's face. The husband came, picked the employee up, took the employee home, and the other employee never reported this event to the manager for about 4 days. So in that 4-day period of time, a lot of missed opportunity. Fitness for work testing, seeing what patients might have been affected, what patients didn't get their medicine, all of those type of things.
And just to touch briefly on coverage, any claim involving criminal activity is going to raise coverage issues. The specific perpetrator of the crime clearly is not going to have coverage under most liability policies, if not all. There are intentional acts exclusions. There are arguments about whether the crime itself is within the scope of employment or is within the scope of professional services as defined in your policy. So there are issues that will need to be addressed if you ever encounter a claim along these lines. There are, and most of the civil litigation that may follow will entail both bodily injury claims or patient rights or elder abuse claims and some type of fraud allegations and allegations of negligent credentialing, negligent monitoring and supervision of employees. So they'll raise potential corporate liability, and so there may be a way for the organization to bring the lawsuit within the scope of coverage, even if there's no coverage for the individual. But there still will, the fraud claims are subject to a number of potential exclusions. They almost always entail punitive damage claims, which are often also excluded. And so any claim of this nature requires careful assessment of coverage.
Pete, if I could just add 2 points to that. First, you'll see up there is batch coverage, and I can see Larry's eyes burning a hole into my head. What do you do when you have a single tortfeasor and 100, 200, or 1,000 patients, each with very slight differences in their allegations against the hospital? What happens when it expands multiple years and multiple locations? And the biggest issue is what happens when the common nexus linking all of these claims, being the purported basis for batch, is a criminal event and not negligence. So there's the one, I guess, takeaway on the coverage piece of it is start thinking about these scenarios and start looking at your policy, talk to your brokers, and ask yourself, how would my policy likely respond to this scenario? Because Pete's absolutely right. The last time you want to start discovering coverage wrinkles is when you're on the 6 o'clock news and one of your employees being taken out in handcuffs. You don't want to be calling your broker, am I covered for this one? Because the answer probably is not that clear. So I would not wait until that event happens. Look at your policy, speak to your broker. How does your policy respond to a true mixed claim of uncovered and covered loss?
Great. The risk management techniques, as we've already talked about, overlap for each of these issues, and we're going to delve into some more specific recommendations and ideas.
So social media, I would be guessing that everybody has a social media policy at their hospital. If they don't, they should. It's very important to have a social media policy. And although you can't incorporate every single thing in one policy, one of the recommendations is to have a statement within the policy saying that all other policies of the hospital pertain to this social media policy. Because one of the main things you're worried about with social media is protected health information and that getting out. Also, in the policy, make sure it clearly states that the employee, not the institution, the employee is personally responsible for everything that employee posts on his or her social media. It's also important to have guidelines around what you can and cannot say on your social media as an employee. So for instance, where we've seen some social media is among employees either complaining about work or complaining about a coworker or complaining about a patient. there should be some statement in there that anything on social media that relates to the institution, you need to be professional and you need to be respectful, and that if you have any sort of views on social media that relate to healthcare or relate to the institution, that the employee specifically states that those are the employee's own opinions and they are not the opinions of the institution with whom the employee is affiliated. Another important thing to do is have your media relations department or IT, someone within your institution who can kind of search out in the internet and see when your institution's name comes up and see exactly what is affiliated with your institution. We found out that there was a patient who did not have a particularly pleasant experience with a healthcare provider, and that patient posted it on social media and used our institution's name, so we were able to find that out, which was very good. Which wasn't necessarily so good was that an employee, the one who the patient had been complaining about, also found it and was bickering back and forth between the patient about the care that was rendered and why the care was rendered, and things of that nature. So those are just some general guidelines. If you search the internet, you will find a lot that addresses this. One of the things that we'd like to recommend is if you have a prospective employee, it's not a bad idea to go onto their social media site and kind of see what's there, because if you see things from this person's previous employment that you don't think is something that you would want posted at your institution, then you have a kind of a heads up well before that patient or that person becomes your employee. And it's also really, really important to train your employees and your medical staff about social media, proper uses, improper uses, things of that nature. And as Steve and Pete have said, train them that they should not be on social media during their work time, not permitted.
So one of the risk management initiatives needs to include the screening of new employees. Most states, I think, are heading toward not allowing a criminal background check before hiring someone. But once an offer is made and accepted, the offer can be conditional on an acceptable criminal background check. We talk in terms of standard of care in medical malpractice cases. There's a standard of care for or standard practice in the hiring of employees, which I think now includes 50 state criminal background checks. It's evolved over the last few years. It may have been appropriate at one point just to search in Maryland or New York or Illinois, but now I think it's pretty well established that we should be doing 50 state background checks, and may not be quite the time for mandatory drug testing in the healthcare industry, but I think we are headed toward that as well. And I also think it's important to consider implementing a regular sort of a re-credentialing of all those hospital employees who are not credentialed as physicians are every 3 years. So maybe you'll be doing a follow-up background check on nurses and other employees every 5 years, or maybe less frequently as necessary. But people's lives change, their family backgrounds change, their family situations change, and you want to be a step ahead of the potential problems that might come up as a result of changes in people's lives.
So did you want to talk about chaperoning?
Yeah, after the Dr. Levy event, my boss, Dr. Y, who is in the room right now, was adamant that we needed to develop a chaperoning policy. And we did, but we found that it was really, it wasn't as easy as one would think, because we got a little bit of pushback, because we couldn't necessarily say every time you examine a patient from the waist up or the waist down, you need to have a chaperone, because then you would need a chaperone pretty much for every single patient in the hospital. So we tweaked it a little bit to focus on when you're doing clinically indicated breast exams or when you're doing procedures that would involve the genitalia, things of that nature. And very important that you identify who the chaperone is in the medical record, so that if there is an event where a patient might accuse a provider of improper behavior, you really are able to do a better investigation to really look and see, okay, nope, we did have a chaperone, this is who that was, and verify that indeed that individual was a chaperone and was in the room at the time. Great. Drug diversions. You know, there's a lot that has been happening in hospitals, doing a lot in order to combat this problem. And one of the things that has been very effective is hospitals getting together. It's called a drug diversion task force, committee, however you name it, multidisciplinary. So you have nursing representatives, you have physician representatives, you have pharmacy representatives, but you also have infection prevention, because you never know when, you know, it might, there might be a risk that patients actually got infected by a diverting employee. Human resources should be a part of that, because if an employee diverts, there are going to be, or should be, human resource actions that need to occur. And the committee, the task force, whatever you want to call it, really needs to, should be monitoring what diversions are going on in the hospital setting and what the response to those diversions is. Comprehensive policy about drug diversion. And really, what it needs to say is there will be a zero tolerance to any employee diverting drugs. And for healthcare providers, sometimes that's hard, because we're compassionate people and we want to take care of our employee. We don't just want to fire our employee, but it's really important at the beginning of their employment that the zero tolerance for diversion is clearly articulated and understood. And you can still care for the employee after the termination by getting that employee help or continuing their health benefits so that they can seek help. But, I mean, just what Pete said with the radiation technologist who just kept going and going and going, and, or, you know, Steve's unfortunate example where the employee was found and nothing really happened to him. There needs also to be a lot of surveillance. And by surveillance, I mean the pharmacy checking out several different medication administration equipment, the Pyxis machines, the Omnicells. There's software that helps the pharmacies do that. I know at our flagship hospital, they do at a minimum of 10 different sort of audits in order to figure out if employees are diverting. The audits are done, some are done daily, some are done weekly, some are done monthly. So an example would be a monthly report is sent to each nurse manager of employees who are 3 standard deviations from the norm as to how many medications they're actually taking out of the Pyxis. They also do reconciliation for controlled substance. They'll do check to see, you know, what's being wasted, how is that being wasted. Unreconciled controlled substances dispenses override reports. So they'll look to see, is an employee overriding the Pyxis machine, or are employees taking out controlled substances when there's no order for those controlled substances to be given. Another thing that the pharmacy does is to periodically test controlled substances that come back to the pharmacy to make sure that what's really in that vial truly is a controlled substance and isn't actually normal saline or something of that nature. We've also switched for our fentanyl pumps and some of our other controlled substance infusion systems a no-port IV line. So whereas with the radiation technician and some others where they would stick a needle in a port and withdraw the controlled substance, they cannot do that now because it is a no-port system. So if they actually stick a needle in the IV line, it will weep, it will, there'll be some evidence of tampering. And I have to say, education of the employees is so very important. And the education is on multi levels. So one of the pieces that is important to stress is that, you know, we really want to stop drug diversion. A, yes, it's bad, but B, it could kill your coworker. So your coworker could overdose as a result of diversion. It also can harm our patients. And so part of the education really goes to why it is important for you as an employee to really pay attention. Don't just allow your staff member, your coworker, to say, you know what, I just gave 5 milligrams of morphine. I know the vial was 10 milligrams. Don't worry, I did waste it, but here, can you sign? No, 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 no. Never should be permissible. So a lot of things like that. One of our employees actually noticed that one of the fentanyl bags was less full than it should have been. I don't know if I'm saying that right. There was less fluid in the bag than she thought should be in the bag. And so she reported it to the pharmacy, and guess what? They found tampering on the bag that indicated that, yes, indeed, the bag had been tampered with, and then the investigation went as to, okay, now we need to figure out who was diverting.
Okay, I see we're getting close to the time. This is just a very interesting article that talks about what's coming down the road from Human Resources, Society of Human Resources, and just some changes that we might be seeing occurring in the near future. And then, any other comments on that?
Nope.
Okay. All righty, and then what's coming on the horizon?
You know, we actually put this slide together before Hurricane Maria, or whatever hurricane hit Puerto Rico. But there was an article in the New York Times in October, about a month ago, that said 80% of the drugs used by Americans, 80% of them are manufactured in Puerto Rico. Other scary thing is all of the mini bags that are used throughout hospitals in the United States, manufactured in Puerto Rico, along with the tubing. So we've had drug shortages. I mean, it's an ongoing issue in healthcare. Some critical drugs, epinephrine, sodium bicarb, all of those things. I mean, our pharmacy sends out at least 3 times a week kind of what are the drug shortages, what is the status of the drug shortages, and that list is not decreasing. And I think with what happened in Puerto Rico, it's not going to decrease for a long, long time. And it concerns me a little bit because I think there is a potential for liability when you have a patient who might have a medical emergency and you don't have the drug readily available to treat that patient, or more likely, you have to go outside your normal process. So I remember with epinephrine, they actually had to mix the epinephrine and do all this. It wasn't prepackaged in the way that the staff is used to administering it, which puts them at risk for delay and puts them also at risk for improper administration.
The next one's technology, the Internet of Things, and that's kind of just a hodgepodge of random bad things that could happen with technology. And 2 examples jump to my mind right off the bat. One is hackable devices. So there's been a lot of articles the past couple weeks about pacemakers, insulin pumps. All of these devices can now be hacked, and so you could have issues where it's either a ransomware type scenario or a terrorist act. But it's terrifying. So, my 7-year-old is a type 1 diabetic, and 2 days ago, her pump malfunctioned. And so for the past 48 hours, my wife feels like she's in the Stone Age, running around with an insulin pen, and the 7-year-old hiding throughout the house. So when that happens, it's hard to remember what to do because you're so used to the technology. And another recent example, we have an insured who recently switched to EMR, which is fantastic, and we applaud that, and we really encourage them. Unfortunately, their EMR system went down for almost 3-4 days. And what was shocking is, from a risk perspective, when some of the attendings would tell some of the residents, go do something, they had no idea how to do it manually. And so we've become so dependent upon technology. What happens when it's all of a sudden unusable? And so that's one of the issues we're always looking out for.
So we have employees filing antitrust claims, typically thinking, envisioning physicians in this category. We're in an era of, an increasing effort to bring physicians into into medical practices or to be direct employees of the healthcare organizations. But think of a doctor or a small group that does not meet expected revenue targets and is shown the door in favor of a group recruited from elsewhere that offers a better profit margin. You're likely to see some type of litigation, and it may include antitrust claims because you're depriving someone of his or her livelihood. In addition to that, in the era of social media, and you are likely to get hit by the bad publicity, which raises the specter of the reputational risk, and the case may end up being tried in the press before you even get a chance to raise your defenses in court.
Drones is one thing we're just advising folks should ask what's going on internally, whether it might be facilities management staff and some inadvertent things that might happen with maybe the either damage to some property. It might be construction managers that you're working with, that you're contracting with. I know in our area there was publicity a couple of months ago about using drones from the Amazon effect to deliver medications, pick up medical supplies, medical test results, tests, blood samples. And this is an area where maybe it's a person doing it. They may not be carrying any insurance at all. There are common exclusions, so it's worth at least asking what's going on.
And then use of mid-level providers. The use of mid-level providers, I know you all know, is just increasing dramatically. Nurse practitioners, nurse midwives, physician's assistants, and they're all lobbying their particular professional associations that they really don't need any supervision, and now many of them, they don't need supervision, which isn't to say they shouldn't have some sort of supervision. It really is how, providing care is a team sport, and we just know that in our institutions, we struggle a little bit with that because we want physicians involved in the care, even when these patients are being managed by a mid-level provider, because number one, we feel very strongly that, and I won't use it, we don't like to use the word supervision, we'll use collaboration. But, really have the medical team approach with a lot of these mid-level providers.
And I have two other points to raise in this context. The first, I think we'd be remiss if we didn't mention sexual harassment, since that is absolutely the news of the day. Healthcare organizations are not immune from that. The Dr. Levy class action resulted in a $190 million settlement. About 4 years ago, there was a wrongful termination case in California involving a single physician assistant as the plaintiff who believed that she was being harassed by a physician and raised that with hospital management, and she was fired. She sued, and she got a judgment of $167 million. So there are serious potential ramifications for us, and we all need to keep that in mind. And the last point I'd like to raise and leave with you is that in the era of very strong False Claims Act enforcement, we're seeing many prosecutions against prescribers and overprescribers of opioids. And the opioid crisis is in the press almost as frequently as sexual harassment is. I can guarantee you the plaintiffs' bar, nationally, regionally, locally, they are all exploring the possibility of developing theories of liability against hospitals for the overprescription of opioids because doctors don't have enough insurance coverage to come even close to the potential exposure.
Great. Any other comments or no? Any questions or comments from the audience?
How does involving something like PHS or physician health services or the equivalent for the other health professionals affect
So are you saying if a provider diverts?
Any kind of fraction in a given week, and then you refer them to PHS, and then they come back, is that, and then you terminate them if they have another infraction. Does the PHS referral sort of lessen the liability?
You know, I would argue probably not. And mostly, I would say that because I think plaintiffs' lawyers are very good at having juries understand or believe that we as healthcare providers are there to protect absolutely every patient within our institution. And if we know of a patient or of an employee who diverted, we didn't terminate that employee, and that employee went, even though we sent that employee, to get help, that employee comes back, is in our institution, and has a second offense, and then we terminate. I don't think a jury is. I don't see it as really lessening the exposure, but I'll defer to Steve on that. What are your thoughts? Oh, behavioral problems? Oh.
It won't help you if you're on the wrong end of the lawsuit, but it's the right thing to do. And it should never hesitate to do that, to send somebody to get help.
Well, thank you very much.
Nope, I think we're good.